have a essential question here. How does the scientific community collect, evaluate, and share information? So I want you to keep that question kind of in the back of your mind as we move through the unit here today, and kind of see if by the end of this lesson we can answer that question. I'll start us off with just science skills. What are the things that are really essential to being a good scientist? And the first thing here is that science uses observations, inferences, predictions, and experiments to build and organize knowledge. So the goal of science is to build and organize knowledge, but how do we get better at doing that? Well, we have to make observations. We have to be able to infer from what we're observing. We have to make predictions, and we have to conduct experiments. Now, humans are naturally curious to discover new knowledge, and I think this is something that we can see in every asset of our lives. Right now, people are interested in epidemiology and virology. We're interested in what continent might be across the sea, or is the world flat or is it round? We're interested in what's beyond Earth and outer space. What are these things that go into our body? How do they how does food nourish our body? How do diseases affect our bodies? So there's lots and lots of questions that we're curious about. Those are all big scientific questions, but it might be as simple as, if you're playing basketball, what will happen if I try to crossover dribble or dribble between my legs? Will this move work on this defender? If you're playing video games, what's in this next room? What's in this chest over here? So we're always very curious creatures, trying to discover new knowledge. We're not always as natural organizers of knowledge, but we know in science that organizing knowledge is critical to being able to attain more of it. So what are observations? Well, they must be detailed and clearly stated to communicate ideas. And then there are two types of those: qualitative and quantitative. If you look at just the last couple of slides, look at how we, in the first term here, we define kind of what science is, and now we're digging into that word observation. We'll do the same with inferences and predictions and experiments down the road here. And now we're digging into observations even more as the two types of it. Qualitative is just going to use words, no numbers. You see the example there. And then quantitative describes quantities, numbers, and you can see it doesn't really matter if that's written out or just the numerical value of 3 in that last example. They're both quantitative. Now, quantitative observations tend to be more precise. And on the slide it says everyone agrees, but that's not necessarily true. Numbers allow less dispute, but take, for example, right now in the COVID-19 pandemic. People disagree about how the numbers of deaths are being calculated. People disagree about economic data that's numbers. If you look at jobless claims or unemployment, things like that, people can still disagree about numbers, but at least we find that numbers allow for better comparison, better evaluation, and it allows us to kind of have better arguments around those numbers. So scientists try to use quantitative observations, not just qualitative. But first, let's practice figuring out some qualitative observations here. So, with this example, I'd ask you to think of an observation for each of these 4 descriptions. Pause the video and then check as a way of making sure that you are coming up with some good examples of qualitative descriptions. So I'll pause. And then now coming back, you might say something like the ball is round, or the ball is red, or the ball is flat. You could say the needle is sharp, or the needle is metal. You could say the mountain is tall, or far away, or small. You could say the water is clean. You could say the water is clear. You could say it's dirty. You could say there's a lot of water. Those are all qualitative observations. We're just not using numbers. We move to quantitative. And again, if you could come up with a quantitative observation, we'll pause the video. And then checking back, you could say there are 4 triangles. You could say triangles have 3 sides, or triangles have 3 corners. The next one here, you could say there are 3 arrows. The next one, you could say there is 1 frog, or the frog has 2 eyes, or every 4 seconds the frog tongue is launched. All of these now involve numbers, which makes them quantitative. Inferences are logical explanations of observations. They have to occur after the observation is made, and it makes sense of an observation. Now, you might have more than one inference possible based on an observation, and we want to point out that this is not a final answer. One observation, one inference doesn't necessarily mean other ones can't be correct. And inferences still tend to be assumptions. We haven't conducted an experiment yet. We're still just in that kind of processing phase. So I want to walk us through a scenario here. You see a picture there, and in the picture, I'm just providing kind of some basic information. But if we think about what a qualitative observation is, I might make the observation that the apple fell. I could also say the apple is red. Both of those are qualitative, no numbers. Now, if I want to get more precise here, I can say the apple fell 10 meters. And now that first value becomes quantitative. As it turns out, we can also make color a quantitative value using the wavelength of light that's produced. But that's a little bit more advanced science, and so we're going to stick with this apple fell 10 meters quantitative observation. Now, I want to make an inference based on the picture here, and there will be a question on the exam about this, so it's important to kind of think carefully here. If I give you the example, gravity caused the apple to fall, that seems like a reasonable inference based on the picture. We know the apple fell. Why is it falling? We're kind of wondering why that is, and it seems reasonable to say that gravity caused it, especially because the tree is close to what looks like Earth here. Gravity might pull that down. But on a multiple choice question, you might see things like this. All of the apples will fall before winter. The problem with this inference is it's really not based in the picture. It's based in your understanding of reality. You know that apples tend to fall by the fall and by the winter. But we don't want to just make that assumption here. The picture isn't really giving you anything to make you think that winter is coming. This tree could be in Florida. Maybe the apples won't fall. We don't know. Also, to say all of the apples will fall 10 feet or 10 meters, I should say there, that's just going to be a false observation because not all the apples are at that same height. So they're definitely going to fall some different values besides 10 meters. And so you can see here the first one of these explains something that's not present in the observation, and the second one is false based on the observation. Next up, I want to look at experiments. These are scientific investigations, and they involve variables, constants, and controls. And guess what? We're going to have to define some of these other terms to really understand what an experiment is. So variables are probably the most important part of an experiment. They're factors that can be changed. One variable is changed to determine the effect on another variable. And we'll get a little more detail on that soon. But the key is that we only want to be changing one variable at a time to conduct a true experiment. If you're changing 2 variables, they're going to have potentially counterbalancing effects. They can amplify each other. They're just massive problems with changing more than one variable at a time. To truly learn something, we only want to change one variable purposely at a time. So there's 3 types of variables. The independent variable is the one I just talked about. The scientist is going to change this variable. It's often called the manipulated variable. The dependent variable responds to changes in the independent variable, and scientists want to measure these changes. So sometimes we call this a responding variable, sometimes we call it a measured variable, but dependent variable is kind of the basic name for it. Now there's also constant variables. Sometimes we call these controlled variables, but these are variables that we're going to keep constant so as not to affect the responding variable. We'll go through a bunch of examples, but in general, in life, there's many factors that can influence an experiment, and scientists have to actually think carefully about what those factors are and make sure that they stay the same throughout the experiment. So there's often many constants in an experiment. Now, we haven't introduced this term yet, but I'm sure you're familiar with it from past courses. Hypotheses are just going to be educated guesses here, or the word I really love, predictions. And they're predictions specifically about how the independent variable will affect the dependent variable. And as you can see, these are going to be made before we conduct any experiments. Hypotheses are these predictions about what will happen, but they should be well educated. Now, the bottom here is a little bit confusing, but generally the format for writing a hypothesis is going to be to reference an increase or decrease in the independent variable, and that will cause an increase or decrease in the dependent variable. And then we do want to tack on usually a reason why we make that prediction. So right here, this third bullet point probably looks pretty confusing. I'll have you write down the blanks that you need to, but we'll get to see some examples that I think will help with this. All right, so this next slide is an example experiment. A chemist wants to study the effect of caffeine on mice heart rates. Now, we're already giving you a lot of information there, but we want to just pull out the independent variable, the dependent variable, the controlled variables, and the hypothesis. So let's start out with the independent variable here. I'll ask you to pull out the independent variable. Remember, this is the topic, the variable that the scientist is purposely going to change, and then we can check our answers on that. So the presence of the caffeine is going to be the independent variable. If you said amount of caffeine, that would be perfectly fine there as well. And then what depends on that presence of that caffeine? What will respond to that change? That's going to be our dependent variable. So I'll pause the video and have you pull that out. And so the dependent variable is the heart rate of the mice there. Lastly, then, we want to figure out the controlled variables. These are the things that, we have to kind of take a moment here and think, okay, how does caffeine affect heart rate? What else could possibly affect heart rate? And as a scientist, we want to make sure that that doesn't mess up our experiment. So I'll let you think of probably a few controlled variables here. We'll pause the video, and then we'll check back in. Just a couple I came up with were age of the mice, size of the mice. I think one great one is to think about the exercise history of the mouse. So if one of the mice just got done with a run on its little hamster wheel, so to speak, that mouse is probably going to have a high heart rate. If you don't give that mouse caffeine and you give another resting mouse caffeine, you might conclude that caffeine decreases the heart rate of the mice. But that doesn't make a lot of sense, and the problem was that we didn't control for exercise in our study. All right, the last part of this slide I think is going to be the hardest here. We need to come up with a hypothesis. And remember I said I want you to link the independent and dependent variables together. So we're making a prediction here. We've done a little research on caffeine. We kind of think we know what it's going to do to the mice heart rates. And now we need to write that out. So I'll give you my hypothesis here, and it's going to be that increasing the amount of caffeine will increase mice heart rate because caffeine is a stimulant. So if you think about this, you're really, you're choosing increasing or decreasing as this first word, and then you're putting in your independent variable, the amount of caffeine, and then what will that do? Well, that will either increase or decrease. In this case, I think it's going to increase mice heart rate. And then why? We've got to have just a little bit here, and in a little bit of research, you'd find that caffeine is a stimulant. We anticipate that it would increase the mice heart rate, and we're ready then to kind of conduct an experiment because we've really thought about what are we going to change, what are we going to measure, what are we going to keep the same, what do we think is going to happen. Now we're ready to actually conduct an experiment. Maybe not quite ready. There's one more thing we should think about. It's always best to involve a control group in an experiment. This is a group that's placed in the same environment but not subject to the independent variable. Now, if we think about this mice experiment, these would just be mice that don't get the caffeine, But whatever we do with the other mice, if the other mice are going to run first, then we want these mice to run first. It's a way of kind of confirming that you're factoring out anything else that you might not have considered as a control variable with the control group. So the purpose of the control group, just make sure you don't confuse the control group with controlled variables. They are different things. But the purpose here is if you have an effect observed on this group, then it kind of alerts you that, there might be a problem with the experiment here. Something might not have been placed into a controlled variable that should have been. All right, so next up we have the scientific method. And the scientific method is a process used to find answers to questions about the world. And so when you think about a process, that always involves steps. So a process means there are going to be several steps involved, just kind of guiding steps to keep you on track here. So now we got to figure out what are those steps. And you'll see a few different types of lists on these steps for scientific method if you were to Google it online. But we're going to use this set here for our class. And the first is going to be to make observations with the senses, to explore. A lot of people jump to part 2 here, state a problem in the form of a question. But you really have to be making observations first. So if you were a scientist who was studying patients with COVID-19, maybe trying to determine their symptoms, you're not going to necessarily have a question initially. You're just going to be working in the medical field, making observations, seeing, a lot of people are getting the same symptom. That's a problem. So what, or that's your observation. Now, what is a question? What's a problem? And the question might be, well, what virus is causing these symptoms, or are these similar symptoms being caused by the same virus? So you would have to then move ahead and kind of make a prediction. So your prediction might be, patients with these new symptoms that we haven't observed, or this new set of symptoms, they are all being infected by a similar virus. So that could be your prediction, and you'd have to set up an experiment to kind of prove that to be true. So this is part 4. You design your procedure, you conduct an experiment. This is where you'd identify, in that designing procedure, and sometimes you have to do part of this before you make your hypothesis. You got to figure out what's your independent variable, what's your dependent variable, what are the things that you want to keep constant in the experiment. All of that has to kind of be done to help you with that prediction. But we put this here at step 4 because you're not actually conducting your experiment until all of that mental work is done ahead of time. Then you've got to record your results, and you've got to analyze those results. Some lists will have those broken up into 2 separate phases, but consider this kind of your post-lab. You've done the work, you've got your results, but you got to do some analyzing here before you can draw a conclusion supporting or rejecting the hypothesis here. So generally speaking, scientists always want to refer back to, what did we predict was going to happen, and is that what we saw happen, or did we see something different happen that rejects that hypothesis? So let's walk through a lot of this with that apple tree example. An observation would be apples fall to the ground. So the question here is, do all apples fall to the ground at the same speed? And you can just go ahead and pretend that period is a question mark there. Do all apples fall to the ground at the same speed? That's our question, our problem in the form of a question. So you could come up probably with a reasonable hypothesis in either direction, but I'll tell you mine based on a little knowledge of physics. I would think that increasing height will cause an increase in apple speed. And then I want to have a reason here. So it's because gravity acts on the apple for a longer period of time. So I chose increasing. You could have said decreasing, but I said increasing height. That was my independent variable. That's what we're going to change. Will cause an increase in apple speed. That's my dependent variable that we'll measure. So distance or height is independent, speed is dependent. But what things do we need to keep the same? So take a moment. There should be a few things we could think about here. And then we'll see that if you change the size of the apple, the mass of the apple, the shape of the apple, the wind conditions, the elevation of the tree, If you did this experiment on different planets, now I know that's not very realistic, but if you took an apple tree on Mars and an apple tree on Earth, the gravity of planets is actually going to be quite different, and that could affect your results. So we want to keep all of those things constant. Those are controlled variables. And then we come to the next slide here. So I'm just going to give you some results here. If I give you results here, I have 5, 10, 15, 20 meters. And these are actually the results you would get if you did this experiment in perfect conditions. From 5 meters, it would hit the ground at 9.8 meters per second. At 10 meters, that gravity is operating for a longer time. It's going to hit the ground at 14 meters per second. At 15 meters, we'll see that we have a speed of 17 meters per second when the apple hits the ground. And then at 20 meters, we're going to have a speed of 20 meters per second when the apple hits the ground. So my conclusion here is that the hypothesis increasing height will cause an increase in apple speed is supported by the data. And then you would go on to discuss that a little bit more in a lab report, but we see the conclusion there is it confirming, supporting the hypothesis. If your hypothesis had been the opposite, then you'd want to be saying that the data rejected your hypothesis here. So one of the other things we'll be talking about this unit is going to be graphing, but I think that it's a good time here to just think about the independent and dependent variables in these graphs. So in this graph, I would think that the elevation would be the independent variable, and then we would measure air temperature in response to that. So a hypothesis here, it could be we're looking at the effect of elevation on air temperature. Doesn't make sense to really make a hypothesis because I'm already giving you the data, so this is already after the experiment. But a conclusion here might be as you increase the elevation, the air temperature decreases. And we'd want to have a reason. I would recommend saying something along the lines of because there are fewer air particles as you move higher into the atmosphere. You could graph something like this here with the type of vehicle and its fuel efficiency. So the independent variable is the type of vehicle, and the fuel efficiency would be the dependent variable that depends on the vehicle. Here's one where you look, this would just be an average of all cars, and this actually is real data as well. In 1970, the average fuel efficiency on the market was 14 miles per gallon. By the year 2000, it was 22. So here we'd have a nice conclusion of as you increase the years and time, you're also going to see fuel efficiency increase. So I want to take us back to that original question, how does the scientific community collect, evaluate, and share information? And I broke it into 3 separate aspects here. So in terms of collecting, well, they record their observation, we make logical inferences, we make thoughtful predictions, we conduct experiments, we use a control group. Those are all things that related to collecting data. We analyze results in the evaluation phase. We didn't talk a lot about evaluating so far. And then in terms of sharing, tables and graphs are things that I've shown you here already to compare results with hypotheses. And then we'll also be talking about the metric system in this unit to ensure consistency with our measurements. But that really kind of gets back to that core question, and it's always good to be bringing things back to those essential questions. So that concludes our lesson, and please make sure you complete any assignments based on this material.